Good afternoon. This video lecture is about chapter 15. It is about persuasive speaking. Let me get you going when it comes to sharing this screen so that way we can begin this lecture. Don't mind the air going through. Away we go. Persuasive speaking. This chapter talks about and it lists three types of persuasive appeals described by Aristotle. The chapter also goes into explaining Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how it can be used in a speech. And finally, it'll define an emotional appeal and provide an example for you. Don't mind the background noise of all that air. It's just this wonderful laptop heating up. This is a very interesting ad that I found when it comes to persuasive speaking. In this chapter, you have gone through, it talks about ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos, obviously, is the ethical approach of persuasive speaking. It delves into either or both, I should say, competence and character. Competence has to do with how an audience regards a speaker's intelligence, their expertise, and their knowledge of the subject. Character has to do with you in it regards the speaker's sincerity, trustworthiness, and concerns for the well-being of the audience. So I brought in this particular ad. This is from the 1950s. It shows how more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Think about it this way. That was back in the 1950s. We are well into the 2000s. The ethical standpoint of a doctor doing that ad today would be null and void. He wouldn't have any credibility, even though he has the intelligence and the expertise and the knowledge on a subject. So when you look back at that 1950s ad, can you imagine how many people trusted this doctor when they saw him on an ad smoking Camels? Because apparently it is better than any other cigarette, and that more doctors smoke that than anyone. So it dives into his sincerity as well as his trustworthiness. There are three types of credibilities when it comes to ethos. The first one is the initial credibility, where the credibility of the speaker before he or she starts to speak. So when you think about that, it's basically the body and how it's warming and how it is engaging and inviting to the audience. Initial credibility also has to do with the introduction and how much credibility and expertise you put into the introduction of your speech. Then goes into derived credibility of the speaker produced by everything he or she says doing during the speech itself. So basically, all the credibility that a speaker implements into the body throughout all the main points. And then finally, the other type of credibility when it comes to ethos is your terminal and the credibility of a speaker at the end of the speech, basically your conclusion. So you have to establish credibility throughout your entire speech, expertise, knowledge, as well as your competence and your character. So there's a lot going on for you, but it's very doable depending on how well you feel comfortable with the subject, how well you are with your persuasive speech as you move forward. Now, enhancing your credibility. Since everything you say and do in a speech will affect your credibility, you should say and do everything in a way that will make you appear capable and trustworthy. In other words, give a brilliant speech and you will achieve high credibility. There are ways, though, of unethical persuasive practices that will completely screw you over when it comes to your credibility. Whether you are advocating harm, if you are name calling someone, something, whatever it is, plagiarizing completely destroys a persuasive speaker's credibility. Using offensive language. Why? Because it is a turnoff. Language is a huge part when it comes to credibility. And card stacking, biased and unfair manner. Argument that unfairly stacks the deck for or against an issue. What you want to do as a persuasive speaker is that you want to show all sides, all credible sides, but say the stance that you are taking, whether it is for or against it. in order for you to sound credible. Card stacking takes that credibility away. In order for you to sound credible, you need to show both sides, but still stand on the side that you want to. Ethos as self-evidence. It's all about yourself as part of the evidence that you support in your speech. So what does that mean? It means that the audience is influenced by your demeanor as a speaker as well as your reputation. Here's one thing to keep in mind. When you do talk about yourself, you can give it as an example. You can give yourself as an example as to what the subject is about. Next, the book goes into pathos. When the speaker appeals to the heart and the intellect of the listener. And this is where I find most people have the most difficult grasping when it comes to a persuasive speech, because it's all about emotional appeal. I want to touch on something really quickly, and that is, I should have stopped sharing. Here we go. And that is that pathos has to do with emotional appeal. And when we end up always talking about the subject, when we do our due diligence when it comes to research, when we outline everything, we tend to forget that there's an emotional appeal attached to a persuasive speech. You have to be for or willing against something. And you have to show that in your appeal, or else you're not going to get whoever you're trying to talk to come to your side, if you will. So that is something where you have to constantly work on. And not just that, you also have to make sure that the speech that you're presenting and the topic that you're going to discuss is something where you can push all that appeal to, whether it's happy, whether it's sad, whether it's angry, whether there's reverence. And that's what the book talks about. So keep that in mind when you are trying to pick out a speech topic for persuasive speaking. Going back to pathos, once this is okay and not spinning. The emotional appeals, what Aristotle referred to as pathos, are intended to make listeners feel sad, angry, guilty, happy, proud, sympathetic, reverent, or the like. Basically, what I just touched on. Pathos is a fear of, if you want to inject, or if you want to, I don't want to say inject, but if you want to implement the fear, if you want to get that fear factor going into your audience, you talk about a serious illness, you talk about a natural disaster. Sexual assault makes people fearful and angry. Personal rejection, economic hardship. If you want to tug at their heartstrings when it comes to compassion, you talk about war refugees because they're displaced. You talk about battered women because they are the underserved and that they've been bruised and it feels emotional. You want to talk about neglected animals. Everyone talks about neglected animals. And trust me, there is a form of compassion when you present that. Starving children, victims of AIDS. All those people feel for one another or something or someone. Those are types of compassions that you want to gear towards. If you want to bring out a sense of pride in your audience and you want to tug them in as a sense of pride, you talk about your country, you talk about one's family, you talk about your school because there is school pride, whether, a mascot or, rival schools. In one's ethnic heritage, we're always, in terms of ethnicity, we feel so proud of ourselves and our ethnicity that that's what brings other people in, and in one's personal accomplishments. Moving forward, when it comes to anger, you talk about terrorists and their supporters. You may want, if you want to, implement or get people to be angry, you talk about business leaders who act unethically. You talk about members of Congress who abuse their public trust. Going through the political sphere, there is a term now called career politicians, where people are getting angry about them. So that's something that you may want to discuss and persuade on. Landlords who exploit student tenants is very common when it comes to universities, and vandals and thieves. Horror, if you want that to come out, witnessing a devastation, child kidnap. Guilt, not helping the less fortunate, if you want to have someone or anyone in your audience feel guilty, about not considering the rights of others, about not doing one's best. And if you want to bring out reverence, talk about an admired person, traditions, institutions, and one's deity. So you have a sense of what you need to talk about or what you want to talk about and what you want to bring out in terms of a feeling and an appeal to your audience. When it comes to persuasive speaking, you connect emotions to students to occasions, charisma, and emotion. Express your own feelings. A personal commitment to the topic conveys emotional appeal in your presentation because your interest goes along with knowledge and expertise. You understand your audience's emotion when you bring yourself into that connection. It's where you analyze your audience. Think of it this way: college students who are angry at rising tuition costs. It happens all the time, and even parking, those types of things, student parking, student tuition, student books, just, the athletics and how they make more money and things to that effect. You bring out that type of connection, and it's almost as if when that emotion kicks in, it's almost as if you want a call to action. Pathos generates emotional appeal. So when that happens, you use emotional language, you don't use slang, you don't use harmful language, you develop vivid examples, you speak with sincerity and conviction, because if you don't feel it, then they're not going to feel that connection. Think of yourself as a car salesman and use that emotional appeal to generate a sale. Logos influences to consider, ultimately accept your point of view with logic. It's solid evidence. So you combine ethos, pathos, and now logos, solid evidence. It's one thing to have the evidence. It's one thing to even say you have the evidence. It's another for you to actually show and demonstrate your solid and logical evidence. Evidence is one element of what Aristotle referred to as logos. It's the logical appeal. The other major element of logos is reasoning. So it's kind of like examples. You give the reasoning of the stats and facts that you are trying to tell your audience. And it works in combination with the evidence to make the speaker's claim that much more persuasive. Now that I've shared with you chapter 15, I also want to show you a video that goes into persuasive speaking.
It's your constant companion. It's in your pocket, in your bag, in your hands, or against your head. You use it at home, in class, at the gym, before you go to sleep at night, and first thing when you wake up in the morning. I'm talking, of course, about your cell phone. According to my class survey, everyone in this room has a cell phone, and all of us use it dozens of times every day. But what if your constant companion is dangerous? What if it's hazardous to your health? Evidence is piling up that long-term use of cell phones can lead to tissue damage, tumors, and even brain cancer. Given that there are well over 4 billion people worldwide using cell phones, we're looking at a problem of potentially staggering magnitude. According to Devra Davis, epidemiologist and author of the 2010 book, Disconnect: The Truth About Cell Phone Radiation, we may be watching an epidemic in slow motion. I never thought much about the possible perils of cell phones before I saw a CBS News report on the subject earlier this year. But doing extensive research for this speech made me realize that cell phones do in fact pose a danger to our health. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to try to persuade you to abandon your constant companion. I still use mine on a regular basis, and I probably always will. But I do hope to persuade you to make one simple change in the way you use your cell phone. A change that will protect your health and could even make the difference between a long life and premature death. But first, let's look more closely at the health risks posed by cell phones. Those risks stem from the fact that cell phones emit small amounts of radiation that over time can damage tissue. Every time you use your cell phone, you expose yourself to that radiation. The amount is minuscule in comparison to that given off by X-ray machines, about 1/1 billionth of the intensity. However, Ronald Herbermann of the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute explains that the problem with cell phone radiation is not how much is emitted at a single time, but how much we are exposed to with repeated use, day after day, year after year. It's this long-term use of cell phones that has led researchers to warn about their danger. In one study, for example, the World Health Organization tracked 10,000 cell phone users over the course of 10 years. As reported in the New York Times on November 13th, 2010, the data in this study indicated that subjects who used a cell phone 10 or more years doubled the risk of developing brain tumors. Other studies have reached the same conclusion. Perhaps most important is a 2007 study in the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Medicine that surveyed all the previous research on cell phone use. It found a consistent pattern of increased risk for developing brain tumors among people who used cell phones for more than 10 years. Alan Marks is one of those people. A 58-year-old real estate developer and father of 3. He talked on his cell phone an hour a day for 23 years. 2 years ago, doctors found a golf ball-sized tumor in his brain. There's no question what caused it, he says. It was my cell phone. And Alan Marks isn't the only person to conclude that he's sick because of his cell phone. Anne Gittleman's 2010 book, Zapped, which deals at length with the health problems of cell phones, catalogs people who developed blinding headaches, dizziness, circulatory problems, nausea, and cancer from the kind of radiation emitted by cell phones. Still not convinced about the potential dangers posed by your constant companion? Take a look then inside the thick manual that comes with your phone. You'll see that all cell phone manufacturers warn against keeping the phone right next to your body. Apple, for example, recommends keeping the iPhone 5/8 of an inch away from your body. Makers of the BlackBerry recommend that you keep their phone a full inch away. Cell phone manufacturers don't publicize this information widely, but they clearly recognize that their products are potentially hazardous. So, what's the solution? As I said earlier, it's not to stop using cell phones altogether. I still use mine on a regular basis, and I can't imagine being without it, and I'm sure you can't imagine being without yours. You can, however, take seriously the risks of cell phones and find a way to minimize those risks. Time and again, experts point out that the single most effective way to reduce the risk is not to press your cell phone against your head while using it. Since the phone emits radiation, the closer you put it to your head, the more radiation you expose yourself to. At the very least, you should hold the phone 1/2 an inch to 1 full inch away from your ear, but ideally you should get in the habit of not putting it up to your head at all. I now use my earbuds almost every time I use my phone. Another option is to use your speakerphone. As with breaking any habit, changing the way you talk on your cell phone may be slightly inconvenient at first, but will soon become second nature. You'll be able to enjoy all the benefits of your constant companion without suffering the fate of Alan Marks. If Marks had known the dangers of prolonged cell phone use, he would have done things a lot differently. I wouldn't have held it to my head, he says. I would have used the headset, I would have used the speakerphone, and I would not have had the problems I had. So, please get in the habit of keeping your cell phone away from your ear when talking, and encourage your friends and family to do the same. Start today with your next phone call and continue every day in the future. We can avoid the slow motion epidemic that doctors and scientists are warning us about, as long as we remember to keep this away from this.
And so there you go, class, about that particular speech. It has to do with ethos.
Informative versus persuasive speaking or
And
presenting. And
there's
that's
that.
the topic we're going to talk about
I'm
today,
going to
because
try
in
and
almost
get
any
rid of
kind of
this.
professional role that you were in.
There we go. So the speaker had a persuasive speech about cell phone use and the dangers of it. She did an appeal, an emotional appeal based off of fear. She used all points of ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos was started out with a story, and then it continued throughout the entire body of the speech with research that she orally cited, and then she continued with also the conclusion. She also had pathos when she gave the example of the gentleman that used his phone to his ear and now had some sort of a gallbladder or gallstone tumor. And so those things we're going through, and of course, logical reasoning. So she used all 3 points: ethos, pathos, and logos. That's one type of persuasive speech for you to look at. There are many others if you also start doing your research that ties into ethos, pathos, and logos. That is the end of chapter 15. I hope you learned a great deal as you go into further persuasive speaking.